Okay, everybody. We'll get started right away. I want to thank everybody who's tuned in today. Some of you are joining us again after the first information session 2 weeks ago, and some of you are here for the first time. If you're here for the first time, our first session is archived, I think, on the page that you're on right now. I'd highly recommend that you watch it after this session. We're going to be taking questions by email from the audience so that we can answer them later in this session. If you have a question, please submit those questions to supportivehousing@edmonton.ca. That email address should be at the bottom of your view screen. My name's Chris Henderson. I'm a external facilitator working with the City of Edmonton's affordable housing and homelessness team. To connect with the 4 communities where supportive housing developments have been proposed in Edmonton currently. I want to first provide a little bit of background for those who are just learning about this project. Those 4 sites in Inglewood, MacArthur Industrial and Wellington, King Edward Park and Terrace Heights are all on city-owned vacant lots. Council approved funding for 4 new supportive housing sites in early June. In late June, Council provisionally approved the sale of the land to Homeward Trust, a nonprofit housing developer. It was sold to Homeward Trust for $1 so they could put all available funding toward construction and other capital costs of permanent supportive housing were they to go through. That land sale is all contingent on rezoning approval in MacArthur, Wellington, King Edward Park, and Terrace Heights, and public engagement in all 4 communities. If you look at the supportive housing site on the city's website, the website that you're on, you'll see that we've updated our material to answer some common questions that we've been getting since we started talking to the community about this in June. Again, we also did a session like this on September 1st. Recording of that session's on the same page as this one for your viewing convenience. Because a lot of common questions were answered in that session, we're not going to repeat them. Those questions are all outlined. If you go to the actual YouTube link of the first session, you can see each question and the time code for each. But if you have a question that does not get answered here, that you've already submitted ahead of this, it's most likely in the other session. The purpose of this session is so that you can hear from people with a deep practical experience on supportive housing. And that you can take a bit of a deeper dive into the more specific questions that you've had. Because of public health guidelines, the city is not holding in-person information sessions, which is why we're using this format. So again, you can submit your questions live during this session by sending them to supportivehousing@edmonton.ca, as it shows on the bottom. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible in our 2 hours. But we're going to start first with questions that were submitted by participants in advance of this session. I also want to remind everyone that we have a survey up at edmonton.ca/supportive housing for you to provide input on supportive housing in general, on what a good neighbor plan might look like, and on the design elements for the proposed developments. If you haven't already done so, we'd invite you to take that survey. If you already have, please invite your neighbors to do so as well. The more people we hear from, the better. So with that, I want to introduce our panel of subject matter experts today. After the last session, people had a number of questions about zoning and planning questions, so we've added a panelist from the last session. So each of these people have direct but slightly different experience with supportive housing. First, we have our new panelist, Brendan Pinches, who is a program manager for affordable housing and homelessness at the city. Brendan, we'll give a quick wave. As well, we have Inspector Daniel Jones from the Edmonton Police Service. We have Ashley Baxter, the Director of Community Programs and Services from the Bissell Centre. And we have Emily Dietrich, the Chief Programs Officer for Homeward Trust. So we'll start with the questions. These questions have been pulled from emails we've received over the last few weeks and from the discussions that we've had with the communities. While we're answering our first set of questions, we hope that it will give everyone some time to come up with a question that they might have and submit it. You can send questions in live during this session again at supportivehousing@edmonton.ca. And we'll try to get to as many of these questions as possible. So I'm going to start actually with a set of questions directed largely at Brendan. We got a number of questions around zoning, the selection criteria, and the planning question. So I'm going to start each of these questions with Brendan for a little bit. I know there's a number of people watching today that are keenly interested in these questions specifically. So I want to make sure that we get a chance to do those in kind of a block. Some of the other panelists might have an opinion on some components of these questions, so they're free to chime in at the end as well. So Brendan, first question we got was that both Inglewood and my area, King Edward Park, seem to be getting rather large buildings for such a small spot. These two locations are right next to residential. It's our understanding that some of these buildings won't have parking. With 30 units in the permanent supportive housing building, they can't see how parking won't overflow into an already dense area. So can you address any of that? Just how parking will be handled and what your thoughts on that were, and what some of the city's decision making around that was?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. I'm not sure where the notion that the developments wouldn't have parking came from, but they will have parking. However, the exact number of parking stalls hasn't been determined yet, and I think that's a statement that was made throughout our earlier engagement sessions. So earlier this summer, Edmonton City Council voted to remove the minimum parking requirements from the old zoning bylaw. And as a result, it's up to the developer, so in this case, Homeward Trust, to decide how much on-site parking to provide based on their operations, like the program of the building, as well as the lifestyle and needs of their tenants. So in Homeward Trust's initial concept plans, the parking allocation lined up more or less with the old bylaw requirements. So that was quite a bit of parking, actually. And the final design will offer Homeward Trust the opportunity to evaluate how much parking they'll actually need and plan accordingly. So we know that this tenant group is just establishing housing as a first priority. So based on precedents, car ownership rates, for example, are assumed to be really low at this life stage, and that will be reflected in the amount of parking incorporated in the final design. I should note, though, too, that there's still a requirement to provide accessible parking spots, and at a minimum, there's likely to be some spots for visitors, deliveries, that sort of a thing. But I would also add that this is the sort of feedback that could be raised in the Engaged Edmonton survey that you mentioned, and the results of that survey will be shared with Homeward Trust and also with City Council.
Yeah, it's actually already come up in that. Thanks, Brendan. Ashley, from the perspective of somebody who's actually like a service provider in supportive housing, is there anything you want to say about the need for parking, the amount of parking that you use?
We have, I believe, 8 stalls at our building, and mostly staff, guests, and delivery uses those stalls. I don't even think it's ever happened where we've parked within residential with our 8 spots. We usually have quite a few empty spots still.
Okay, great, thank you. Brendan, going back to you, can you describe the process of selecting and evaluating sites for supportive housing? Who was involved? How many? What other kinds of sites were considered?
Sure. In terms of who was involved, our housing section at the city prepared a plan the Affordable Housing Investment Plan, and that identified supportive housing as the greatest need and highest priority to address. Council then approved that plan and later approved budget dollars to support actions such as land acquisition and the planning and pre-development activities to enable projects like the four we're discussing tonight to move forward. And so to optimize how far that housing budget could be stretched, there was also an effort on our part at the city to scan city-owned lands for potential development sites. So staff from our housing section, that would be me, who's involved in the project development side, as well as my team, worked with other departments across the city. So that's staff from real estate or parks or even ETS, and together with them reviewed city-owned land and identified 4 properties as having the best potential for supportive housing. So the sites that we proposed were the product of a systematic, staged process to sift through properties based on their characteristics, things like access to transit, proximity to services and amenities like parks, libraries, pharmacies, those sorts of things. Development readiness. So we could be looking at a good location, but if it was tied up for another use for the foreseeable future, we did not pursue that site. We also looked at things like the non-market housing ratio in the neighborhood. So we were looking for neighborhoods with less than 16% existing affordable housing. And we also searched for sites where development could be well integrated with the surrounding land uses and built form.
Thanks, Brendan. Can I just have a quick follow-up question on that?
Sure.
When we talked to a lot of the community, or not a lot of the communities, we talked to a couple of the communities, and there were some concerns about, the criteria that we talked about, but, some sites being a little further away from some of the amenities than other amenities. Can you respond to, some of these sites don't always seem completely perfect, but are they generally designed to be best fit?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of the composite profile of all of those things. Clearly something like the site being too small, the site being maybe in a food desert, the site having too high of a non-market housing ratio in that neighborhood certainly would have disqualified it. But if ideally we had a grocery store in walking distance, but that would be the gold standard maybe. But if the site ticked all of the other boxes but was maybe outside of the 800 meters, 1,000 meters, if it was 1.2 kilometers away from a grocery store, we still might have selected that site if everything else looked great. So there was no one size fits all. We were looking for a good composite that checked a lot of the boxes though.
Great, thank you. Just another question actually for either Ashley or Emily, maybe to add some color to this. One of the questions we actually got a number of times is that you're moving people away from the center where there's all the services they require are. But can you talk about putting these in neighborhoods rather than a central area? Maybe Emily?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for the question. So I think that's a really important question because many of the services that are in the central area are geared for someone who is actually experiencing homelessness. And so, of course, when we've moved these folks into permanent supportive housing, they have a home, which means that we've helped stabilize their income levels and helped ensure that their basic needs are met and beyond, and their other support needs are met. So this means that they're no longer seeking out a lot of those services that are in the core related to finding a meal, accessing other supports that they're looking for. So really, the role of the on-site staff as contracted would be to ensure that that person becomes part of their community. So they find a local doctor, they find a pharmacist that's nearby. All of those things could be fulfilled in a neighborhood or nearby. We don't necessarily need to see the concentration that we see downtown to meet their needs.
And how many of their services are actually provided in the supportive housing development?
Yeah, certainly, like many of them. So most of our PSHs, depending on which ones they are, have pharmacy delivered. Also, in addition to that, we have Alberta Health Services staff come in and provide services and support. And then, of course, there's community programs that people access as well.
Ashley, do you want to add anything to that? Great. Brendan, one question we got a number of times, particularly since the last session, was a pretty simple one. Why was the land sold before the engagement began?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks, Chris. As I described, administration's task was to develop a plan for supportive housing that included identifying the potential sites. But in order to have a viable project, the city also needed to confirm the project's funding and the project's developer. So with funding requests out to the federal and provincial governments, the city wasn't in a place to engage on projects that didn't have a funding commitment. So in the end, council made the decision, like you mentioned, in early June to fund these projects, and public engagement actually began after that decision was made. But public engagement certainly ramped up after council approved the sale of the properties to Homeward Trust in late June. But without that sale being approved, the city couldn't actively involve Homeward Trust in engagement activities. And the sales approval put Homeward Trust in a position to speak to the projects and to answer questions that the city could not. The sales approval also required that engagement be undertaken before those sales could be finalized. So that's one of the conditions of that sales approval that council gave.
Yeah, so the sale is actually not yet final. It's just a provisional sale.
Right. Contingent on engagement. Yeah.
Yeah, and rezoning.
Yeah, in 3 out of the 4 cases, rezoning too.
But engagement in all the cases. Okay. Can you tell us why, there's a narrative going on about the number of, the commercial sites being empty and other kinds of buildings being, abandoned or not being used, especially during the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about why closed school sites, existing empty buildings, or vacant hotels weren't taken into consideration?
Sure, and then maybe I can put another lens on the consideration that those were given. It's not that those are all bad options, but from what we know, refurbishing large buildings like vacant schools and transforming them into housing would not be the cost-effective alternative to building new low or mid-rise apartment buildings. It would also be difficult to achieve that same sense of a home or community in a large building like a refurbished school that wasn't designed for residential use in the first place. So a purpose-built project will have all of the pieces in place for a supportive housing project to function best in a way that a regular apartment building, an old school, or a hotel just wouldn't. But the idea of using surplus school sites to create affordable housing is something that the city currently has a program in place to do. So that is something we're doing. But also, like you said, it's been talked about a lot in the news right now that the mayor is, calling on the federal government to provide funding to purchase hotels or apartment buildings to help house people before the upcoming winter season. And if that funding is approved, it is something that the city will look into. But we're still moving ahead with these purpose-built projects that are viable right now to address homelessness in Edmonton.
Okay. Ashley, Emily, do you want to weigh in on the new build versus repurpose?
About the effectiveness of that?
Yeah, I mean, what's the difference really?
So we had a pre-built building at Hope Terrace, and so we've had to make several of modifications to the building to create a space that was usable for staff and residents. And a lot of the building isn't really functional and usable because of pre-built building, which has definitely been a challenge for us. So when you have a building that is meeting the needs of everything and is well thought out, it is definitely because we've had conversations with other programs that have had a building built, and it has definitely eased a lot of the challenges that we experience personally in our program.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Sorry, thanks.
Yep. Go ahead.
I think a couple things that go with a purpose-built building that are really important is the adequate provision of common space that actually meets the needs of programming. That's critical. And I mean, I am asked by the city and to go look at a lot of existing buildings, and there's often not common space or a space for receiving people, which is a really critical part of that permanent supportive housing, because we really want to understand who's coming in the building and who's coming out of the building. The second thing to consider is the materials that are used. There's materials that are used in purpose-built buildings for permanent supportive housing that are really conducive to lasting a long time and being very, very durable. Other than that, we end up being in a cycle of really expensive repairs. I mean, I think the other thing to point out is we are using hotels in Edmonton right now. We are head leasing the Coliseum Inn, and we're using it for bridge housing, which is short-term housing as a bridge to permanent housing. And you know, one of the reasons that that's challenging is the lack of kitchens in hotels. So people aren't able to access food. And it just doesn't really promote independence, because you kind of have to rely on like food being more centrally provided. With that, I think it's really important to say that we're constantly evaluating existing buildings with our partners and on our own. We have a real estate agent that's constantly looking at what's coming on the market to see what would work. We did purchase an existing apartment building in it's on the north side near Nate last year, and we're just retrofitting it. So it's an expensive retrofit, but it met a number of other requirements in terms of having common space, not having balconies, those sorts of things.
Okay, great, thank you. Brendan, very quickly, going back to you. Dan, I'm really sorry, we're not ignoring you. Yeah, I'm sure, looking at the list of questions, I'm sure you'll have lots to say in a bit. But Brendan, when I think there's a sense when we talk to a lot of the communities, and we've done a lot of discussion with the community, with the four communities, and even some with the city as a whole. There's a sense that, you know, that maybe some communities are exempt from this kind of thing. Were new communities or more, I guess, affluent areas considered?
Yes, all parts of the city were considered and turned up in our search, and it's the intent of council as expressed by, you know, the city's policies, and I think some very direct statements from mayor and council that affordable housing has a place in all neighborhoods in Edmonton. And as I mentioned earlier, the availability of city-owned properties guided the locations we selected in this first batch of projects, so that was one limitation. But there is non-market housing in the neighborhoods we might think of as Edmonton's affluent neighborhoods. And the idea that there's no affordable housing in affluent neighborhoods may be due to the fact that people just don't realize it's there, because once it's there, it looks and operates like any other housing development. There's also a recurring question in our engagement, you'll recall, Chris, about why aren't these types of units in Blatchford, for example? And Blatchford is an example that's in its very early stages of development. And for these projects to be built just in the next couple of years, our supportive housing projects, the development ready criteria led us to other options. And we should expect to see affordable units of some kind in Blatchford one day too.
You said that there's that, like, I think you've kind of, part of my question was, is anybody exempt? Like, is there non-market housing in neighborhoods like Glenora? Okay. Sorry, just on the point about the people don't necessarily realize because they you mentioned something that people don't necessarily realize that they have non-market housing in their neighborhood because it doesn't look like what they might expect non-market housing to look like. I think part of that ties back to the question we asked about new build versus retrofit. Ashley or Dan, and then Emily, can you talk a little bit about the ability for these buildings to fit into their neighborhood? Like, not, we'll talk a little bit more about the ability for people to fit in, but like visually, how do they fit? We'll start with you, Ashley.
I'm not sure I 100% understand the question, but like visually and optically, our building doesn't stand out. It doesn't look any different than what like an apartment building in the neighborhood looks like. You wouldn't be able to drive down the street and say that's affordable housing.
Okay, Dan, you've been you're an inspector now, and you've been a beat cop, I think, before, and you know lots of beat cops. What do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to look at is they don't stand out, and it goes back to Brendan's point. People don't know they actually are there. The conversations that we're having are oftentimes because people are just unsure of what they're getting or what the neighborhood's going to have. And I think last time there was a lot of comments about why would you put a homeless shelter in a neighborhood? Well, these aren't shelters. These are supportive housing units, and they look like any other housing unit, and they look like any other apartment, and they look like any other place to live. So on first blush, you're not going to walk by and go, oh, look, there's a permanent supportive housing unit. I think that's, we fear and we worry about what we don't understand or don't know. And that's okay. And that's why we're having the consultation, because we want to make sure that people are comfortable and people feel safe. And I think one thing that's really important to look at is there is, and I'm going to say there's some research on permanent supportive housing, but there's also one of the problems with permanent supportive housing research is that there's no clear delineation of what PSH is or what supportive housing is. So we got to be very cognizant about that. So when we're comparing apples, we have to compare apples to apples. And our supportive housing actually has, we have some standards that are important. But one of the things for success in supportive housing is location. And there's a great article, and it says location, 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 where individuals who are going through and experiencing supportive housing, their perception of safety in neighborhoods that aren't the core actually increases the likelihood of success, because they become a part of a community and become a part of a neighborhood. And it's very important to look at that. And this is about people as much as it's about anything else. But we have to really think about how we have to focus on supporting people in our city.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Emily, anything you want to add?
Our contracted operators are required to do daily uptake of the appearance, in addition to the property management functions that occur, usually based on our property management role. So I guess what I'm saying is sometimes you see that in the form of staff doing things that really contribute to the outward appearance of a building, and those can be things related to helping the residents live there, make sure that their balcony's tidy, or those kinds of things. But I think it goes beyond that. There's a few really great projects at our permanent supportive housing sites where staff and the participants, residents, are coming together with other community members and building gardens and those kinds of things, and it just looks great. But honestly, it's just an apartment building. It looks like an apartment building. You can just drive by it, and there might be, because the new ones will be accessible, so there'll be a wheelchair ramp out front. So that might look a little bit different, but yeah, it looks like an apartment building.
Okay. Brendan, back to you. Were there any kinds of other special housing taken into account prior to the selection of these sites?
Thanks, Chris. yes, the city did take into account the non-market housing ratio. So if that's what's meant by special types of housing, we looked at the presence of those in these neighborhoods. And so the ratio that we look at the city consists of affordable housing in the form of subsidized housing, so charging less than market rent, supportive housing like we're talking about, like we've described tonight, and social housing, so like a deeper subsidy type of affordable housing. And the city has an affordable housing investment, a set of affordable housing investment guidelines, which help us prioritize where our municipal investments are made. And those ratios are part of that. And we look for neighborhoods with less than the 16% ratio of affordable housing. So all of the neighborhoods where these supportive housing projects are located are below that threshold.
Excuse me. Sorry. I did a pandemic mute there. Sorry about that. This is a much more technical question. There's a question that the Saskatchewan River Valley Area Redevelopment Plan doesn't necessarily permit buildings that are 4 stories tall, and that the ARP for that area would have to be removed in order to build a building that's 4 stories or more tall, or 4 or more stories tall. Given that that ARP, the Saskatchewan River Valley ARP, was put in place for the protection of the river valley, without it, will the area be negatively affected? So I guess there's 2 questions there. And from me, as I parse this question out, one is, does the ARP need to be completely removed in order to build a 4 or more story building? And if it does that open up the river valley to be affected negatively? Like, are we not protecting the river valley as a result?
Sure. You're right, kind of a technical question, but if you're familiar with the area, the part of King Edward Park where the project is located, it is on the east edge of the Mill Creek Ravine. And what's being proposed is rezoning subdivision of land that would take our project site, which is being rezoned to a low-rise apartment zone, and the adjacent lot between our project site and the Mill Creek Ravine, which will be zoned as a public utility lot. It has a small EPCOR scrubber station on it. Both of those will be removed from the River Valley Area Redevelopment Plan area. So the plan will otherwise remain in effect. So no, this plan amendment doesn't alter how the plan applies to the River Valley and the ravine system that it covers.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brendan. And then just before we start moving over and asking other people questions directly, Brendan, you've got one last one, and until maybe we bring a couple more on. That will property values of nearby homes be affected? We've had a lot of questions about this. On one hand, we've talked about how the neighborhoods as a whole aren't necessarily affected, but we're not always able to talk about the buildings in closer proximity, or the dwellings in closer proximity to the development. Can you talk a little bit about the effect supportive housing developments have on property values?
Sure, I can speak to the effect, and maybe that there is no conclusive evidence that there is an effect one way or another. There's evidence to suggest that property values are not impacted by the presence of non-market housing, and studies have consistently found that if non-market housing is well designed, fits in with the surrounding neighborhood, is well managed, that the property values of the neighboring homes are not negatively impacted. So there are too many other factors when you're looking to derive, residential property values to be able to pinpoint it to the introduction of non-market housing as a sole determinant factor. Home assessments, sale values, they're primarily driven by local and global economic factors, so a lot of other things in play. And we just looked at a case study conducted by BC Housing Research Centre last year, which looked at the median assessed home values for homes near supportive housing projects in Victoria, Vancouver, Maple Ridge, and Kelowna. And it looks at detached and strata properties within 200 meters and 500 meters and their values 2 years before the supportive housing was announced and 2 years after it opened. And in all but one of those cases, the assessed value continued to go up. And in the one case where the value did drop in the second year after that project opened, it then started to rise again and continued to rise. So it's clearly more of a local and global influence on the property values than just the presence of supportive housing.
But you did mention a couple of criteria there about being well managed, fitting into the neighborhood well, and being well built, and generally well, like the care and attention has to be paid not only to the development itself but also the operation of it in order for it to not have an effect. And that's right.
Yep, and if you've listened to Homeward Trust through engagement or even had a look at the renderings, preliminary renderings, you'll know that a lot of time, thought, and attention and even resources has gone into building design. Those aren't even the final designs, but a lot of attention has gone there, and even seeking the input of people on those preliminary designs. Building design is another big factor that hinges on the project's success, how it fits in and how it functions in the neighborhood.
Yeah. Okay, Brendan, thank you. I'm going to take you off the hot seat for just a little bit. Thanks for everybody for putting up, allowing us to do a block of questions on planning and criteria and zoning. And Brendan will be around to chime in on anything he thinks might be valuable. I want to move to a question for Dan, and then if Emily or Ashley want to talk to it, I'd like them to. But when we're thinking about specifically King Edward Park, there's a question that came in and has come up a couple of times, particularly from people that live very close to the edge of King Edward Park, that there are encampments and a sizable population of people experiencing homelessness living in the Mill Creek Ravine. Doesn't putting a supportive housing site next to that population create additional issues? Won't people that are living in that ravine take advantage of vulnerable people within that residence?
That's an interesting question, and I would suggest that there's obviously I've never done any research on this topic, but one of the things that is clear is when people do get into housing and are supported, that risk becomes mitigated, especially when you're out of the core and you're out of kind of that area that have maybe created your trauma. So I think that question it's an interesting question. It's one of those things where, people, I appreciate that people are being that thoughtful. One of the things that's working with the city right now is we're working to reduce the encampments in the Mill Creek Ravine and trying to bring people into these more stable situations and help stabilize. So I that concern is appreciated. It is because it's thoughtful and it's thinking about the individuals that are going to move into the permanent supportive housing. It's not a concern that I share, because I think people once people start getting their needs met and start addressing their trauma, start addressing their basic needs around food and shelter, they often thrive in those circumstances. So like I said, I appreciate the concern, but I don't share it.
Do it again. I'm sorry. Emily, do you want to add anything here? A little earlier, you talked about the fact that people were in supportive housing means that they've been stabilized in the first place. What kind of protection, to Dan's point that, if you're having your trauma addressed and basic needs met and you've been stabilized and you've got some kind of income source to pay rent, what can you talk about the relationship that you have with the people that people you may used to see on the street, or what your day-to-day life is now that you're in the building?
I think that's a question for Ashley, because it's about the day-to-day life of the person in the building. So maybe if you don't mind, ask Ashley to answer that part, and then I have something I'd like to add related to encampments, if that works.
Sure. Ashley, do you want to? Can you? I know it wasn't the best phrased question I've ever made, but can you talk a little bit about what people's propensity to sort of fall back into a life or be taken advantage of once they're living in supportive housing?
Propensity wise, that similar to what Dan had said, there's a lot of stabilization that occurs. So there's they are meeting their basic needs. So there isn't a need to sleep in the river valley. There's no need to go downtown for a shower or a meal because they have those things in their home. They are connecting with community resources within their neighborhoods, their grocery stores within their neighborhoods, and going home to participate in making meals in their own kitchen and connecting with staff to do that. We see there's also the staff on site. So the question, I believe, was asking about other people taking advantage of vulnerable people living in those homes. Yeah. And if that is something that may happen, there's also staff on site that is monitoring all of these behaviors as well. So we're supporting the residents to helping them, guide them through making good decisions. We're on there on site 24/7 to have conversations and to create self-regulation and all of those behaviors as well.
Do you see an issue next putting a development like this next, like a supportive housing development next to a ravine with a relatively sizable homeless population?
I don't, and based on my experience from, we are located pretty close to the downtown core, and we don't see an issue in that regard. And we have, like I said, we're probably a 10-minute walk from a lot of the core services.
Okay. Emily, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think one thing I'd add is I help chair the encampment response team in the City of Edmonton, and on that team is the city police, city enforcement, city cleanup. By me sitting there, there's also all our outreach staff. And the reason I'm bringing that up is that we are experiencing a lot of encampments in the city, and that has to be acknowledged on this call. It's a really critical challenge that has really been made more complicated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We are faced with some really critical things we need to do in our city. But some things that I'd like you to know about the encampment response that does occur, because I think it pertains to this question. So I agree and echo what Ashley and Dan said, and I think it will be handled by the staff. At the same time, let's say it's not, let's say that camp does impact that permanent supportive housing. Let's just try that on for a minute. That's okay to try on, because what we've developed with the city and EPS is a risk assessment matrix to respond to encampments. And the reason I bring that up is right now there's a lot of encampments, and the recommendation from the CDC and National Housing Authority or health authorities is that we don't want to disperse encampments unless there is critical risk to spreading COVID-19. It's better to have smaller encampments different places than to keep dispersing them and moving people through the city. So the reason I bring it up is part of our response with the encampment response team is actually assessing the risk of all camps and then looking at how that risk relates to our response. So if an encampment was very large or having some impact on the community, or there was a lot of debris or garbage, those factors will factor into the response.
Okay.
I just want to add one thing too, and this is just maybe just to look at there's so many things going on right now when it comes to working with our homeless population in a way that is trying to provide a better experience for individuals experiencing homelessness. And right now, the Edmonton Police Service, ATB, TELUS, Motorola, Bissell, Boyle are working together on a Tech for Homeless project that's trying to increase connectivity for individuals specifically around the pandemic, but also as we move forward. So and I think sometimes what happens when we're talking about something like supportive housing, it gets conflated with, I said earlier, shelters. It gets conflated with everything, but there are so many things going on, and we're working so well together in collaborations with our partners, with business, with other industries that are trying to address these things that people unfortunately link right to supportive housing and don't realize there's that stabilization period, don't realize that there's so much work that goes into working with the individual prior to them getting to that supportive housing stage. So I just think I thought it was worth mentioning.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dan. This next question is going to be for Ashley. After the last session, and actually, and in some of the social media responses, and in fact, throughout a lot of the sessions that we did, people wanted to still know more about the experiences of a wider variety of people living in supportive housing. Can you talk to us a little bit more about different people and their experiences and the kinds of things they say about living in supportive housing?
Yes, so we've had brothers and sisters move in. We've had different family members, cousins. We've had couples move into the building. Our building specifically is for individuals, so there isn't families living in our building, but there are family supportive housings in purpose for housings in Edmonton, in our city. It's people living their day just like any other people live their days. There is, people come home, they go to work, they go to school, they clean their apartments. There's, taking in the summer, planting flowers, participating in a community garden. There is a lot of different types of activities that all of our residents take on and have experiences in the building and within the community. We have a lot of our residents say about living in the community that they really appreciate living in a neighborhood where they feel safe and welcomed. They appreciate the close-knit community the building has with each other. They appreciate how they've developed friends and a safe place to come home and a safe place to have conversations with people. They're happy to have privacy and happy to have access to their own food and eat when they want to versus when they're being served downtown. So a lot of autonomy that they have experienced and appreciate by having a permanent place to live and be stable.
There's a point in there that I want to just get you to expand on a little bit. Can you talk about the community that gets built between the staff and the residents and between the residents themselves, and why that's like Emily's brought it up a couple of times over the last two sessions, and you've mentioned it a few times. Can you tell me why that's an important part of this?
So when someone's experiencing homelessness, it's really isolating. There's a lot of protective factors that go into being a person experiencing homelessness, and it's just isolating. It's lonely. And so when you move into a place where there is a safe, secure, supportive, non-judgmental home to live in, you build a community, you build trust. You have your neighbor who can babysit your cat when you go and stay at a friend's house for a couple of nights, or visit your mom for a couple of nights. There is a staff that are able to check on you if they're, usually we see you in the morning and we haven't, so we go knock on your door to say, hey, what's going on in there? Everything good? Yeah, everything's fine. There's just taking an extra long nap. There's just a relationship built. There's care and genuine love that is being built. And then we also have our community and common spaces that Emily is speaking to. So being able to play guitar together, and we have a karaoke machine that everybody loves. There's a lot of singing and karaokeing that's happening in our building, and we have a lot of meals that are made together, and just a really good relationship, supportive place, just kind of like a family. You have an issue going on in your life, and you're able to go and talk it out, and you can do that at all hours because you have people you can trust to do that, and it removes that isolation piece. And gives you a whole building of people that you can use as your supports.
Did you say that someone looked after your cat? You have cats in these buildings?
In our building, so it's dependent per building, but in our building, yes, we allow cats.
And
and so some of the residents have pet cats.
Okay.
So pets are really therapeutic, and a lot of people experiencing homelessness sometimes have pets while they're homeless, and that is can be, we're allowing them to bring those into the home as long as they're
And do they have quite a bit of success with those?
Yes. It's probably one of the more cuter, the love that our residents have for their pets, and the amount of care and attention that goes into these pets is pretty amazing and adorable.
Okay. Thank you, Ashley.
Can I just make I'm sorry to jump in. I just
go ahead then.
The reason I want to make
anyway.
a comment is, so as many of you know, I'm an inspector of the Edmonton Police Service, but I'm also a PhD researcher, and my researcher is on the victim offender overlap. And there's a quote, and I read it yesterday.
Sorry, Dan, can I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Yeah.
Can you tell me what the victim offender overlap is?
A victim offender overlap is where you look at someone's victimization and then their offending, and that whole overlap as it weaves through their life course. And the vast majority of people are victims long before they're offenders.
Give me a very quick example.
I'm going to try to give you an example that's not traumatizing to hear, but they all are. So a great example is we did some research in a federal women's prison. 100% of the women in that prison were sexually assaulted prior to them ever committing a criminal offense. That's the victim offender overlap.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
And one of the things, and I'm doing a paper on actually housing and how housing is impacted and homelessness impacts our incarcerated population. And there was a quote that I read from a woman, and I think it's important. When we think about human beings and we think about trauma and we think about what permanent supportive housing does, this woman was incarcerated and she said, I know how to be in an abusive relationship. I don't know how to be homeless, so I will go back into an abusive relationship. And that's one person, and the research that I've conducted is with 800 people who have been incarcerated, which is the largest prison research in the history of the country. And I can tell you that flows throughout it. And housing changes behavior and changes people. So I just want to think about, and I know sometimes we talk about technicalities and we talk about different things, but I just really want to sometimes focus on people, on trauma, and the amazing things that happen when Ashley and her team and Emily and her team at Homeward Trust do what they do to address people's needs. And I think those voices need to be heard. So I just want to throw that out there.
Okay. Thanks very much, Dan. So this actually, we're going to put this back to Dan. Actually, sorry, no, I'm going to ask Emily a quick question. We've gone over this a couple of times in a couple of different ways, but I want to make sure that we make sure people have as many opportunities to see it as possible. What are the screening and placement mechanisms that help decide who goes into supportive housing, Emily?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, because I think that the screening and intake processes are a critical component to the success of a permanent supportive housing site for a couple different reasons. First of all, the screening process relates to our entire screening process for the city. So the City of Edmonton has a lot to be proud of in terms of how we've been working on this file. We have something called a coordinated access system, which means there's 80 plus different points in the city where people who are experiencing homelessness can access the same suite of services and intake into the same system. And what that does is it gives us a common database and a common housing readiness assessment tool that helps us understand people's circumstances. And then it helps us understand what program would best match their needs, and then helps us assign them to one of the, 12 plus housing teams in the city. And so the reason I bring that up is that's really the start of the intake process. Someone is experiencing homelessness and they enter into our system, so to speak, and then we learn from them by meeting with them one-on-one to learn what their needs are, where they're going, what their goals are, what their past history and experience of housing, where have they been successful, what has kind of tripped them up along the way. And then we look at that, and then once we've had a chance to kind of have a chance to see that someone's needs may be more complex than living in market housing on their own with limited support, we start thinking about how we can refer them to one of our clinical and high intensity programs. So part of our clinical and high intensity programs is permanent supportive housing. And that's just a simple way of saying is that there's more support on site. And in these cases, for these sites that are being built, that's 24/7 support. And so through that intake process, we gather a bunch of very specific information, and each of the PSH sites also plug into that intake process. And there's also clinical contributions as well. So we kind of take a look at that, and then we can best understand that person and see if they're the right fit for the site. And that's why this is a critical part of this, is that we want to make sure that we set them up to be successful and make sure that there's the right supports on site.
Emily, what happens if somebody's just simply not successful in supportive housing and that just isn't a fit for them? What then?
Yeah, that can happen for sure. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. So a couple different things. We do have a table with all of our clinical and high intensity providers, and that's a table where all of the providers come together and we do something called case conferencing. And case conferencing involves really understanding where someone's come from, how it's worked, and what we need to do to move forward. We have found that sometimes moving someone to a different permanent supportive housing site with a different setup and different supports, actually they can be really successful at that site. Other times we need to plug into more of the healthcare system to find them an option. So it's really case by case basis.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm gonna put this, or Ashley, do you have anything you want to add there? Sorry, I don't mean to keep moving on. Okay, I'm going to talk to Dan, ask us sort of a series of questions about safety, about crime in the community. As a follow-up to our last session, a couple participants actually asked, essentially, how is putting people in this community not considered a major risk to the safety of the community?
Well, I think first of all, I think people have to look at the typology of individuals who are experiencing homelessness and understand that the vast majority of the crime committed by individuals who are in experiencing homelessness, if they do commit crime, is what I would refer to, and what the literature referred to as symptomatic criminality. So it's symptomatic of your homelessness as a result of meeting basic needs. Such as taking cans out of someone else's backyard in order to get some food or in order to address other issues.
Is this a urinating problem?
What's that?
Like urinating?
Yeah, and not having a washroom, not having those types of things. So and that's not even criminal. That's a bylaw offense. So that we have to delineate that. So there's the disorder that comes with homelessness, and then there's the criminality that which we would consider symptomatic. So what you do is you stabilize people, you give them their needs, their needs are being met, and all of a sudden the criminality stops, and we don't have it anymore.
Dan, can I just ask you a quick question there?
Yeah.
Isn't that criminality? Isn't that symptomatic criminality kind of like a hard habit to break?
Not when your needs are being met. The hard habit to break is it's when your needs are being met. These things actually fall in place quite well, especially when you have standards and you have well-run supportive housing. You have individuals who become successful and are not needing to commit any crimes because their needs are being met. And I'll use an example, and this is a supportive housing, but it's also there's an organization or a place called Urban Manor, which is a block away from police headquarters. Urban Manor is a supportive housing, but it's also a managed alcohol program. I have been a police officer for 23 years. I spent 8 years originally in downtown division as a constable in the patrol and in beats. And then I spent 2 years as an inspector in charge of the area. And this is, I don't know the number of people that are housed in Urban Manor, but I will tell you that nobody knows it exists from a policing perspective. I would tell members, the young members in the division, hey, that's a supportive managed alcohol program. And they're like, really? We had no idea what that building was. And in 23 years and 9 there as a constable and 2 as the inspector, I don't know the stats on this, so I'm not going to give it to you, but I can tell you my personal experiences that I never went to a call there. I've gone there, I've spent time there, I've visited the location, I've had conversations with people. When people's needs are met, it changes the game for them. And it's about, and again, with all that's going on in the world right now, with all that's going on in policing, and for me, our need to evolve policing beyond what policing is right now, looking at human-centered design, looking at trauma-informed policing. This, working with our collaborators, and I don't like the word collaborators, I'd rather say partners, our partners, these types of things, and the more we have of them, change the game and actually reduce criminality if they're done properly. And that's where the research, unfortunately, sometimes is hard to suss through, because if there's no standards with permanent supportive housing or supportive housing, and people just say, oh, it's supportive housing, then unfortunately there's some negative impact. When there are standards in the research, you see significant benefit. And again, I'm going to go with this again, is there is a stereotype of criminality around homeless populations, that people think that homeless people are these just out there committing crime, committing violence. That is not the vast majority of individuals who experience homelessness. That is, in any community, there are going to be people that prey on each other, and there's going to be violence. What we need to think about is stabilizing people's lives. There are oftentimes coexisting mental health issues and substance use or misuse issues. But when those things become stabilized, the individual becomes stabilized, and the individual becomes part of a community. And that's why, back to Brendan's point, oftentimes, whether they're supportive or not, and you have these housing operations, people don't even notice them because they become part of the fiber of our society.
Well, just if I can follow up on that though, Dan, is that your? So you mentioned the alcohol managed program. You know, from the perspective of an inspector, someone who's supervised young officers and people working neighborhoods and working a beat, what's the impact of been on robberies, break and enters, assaults in neighborhoods when supportive housing has gone in?
sorry, I was trying to press my button, it wasn't working. The impact is that in the Edmonton context is that there is no impact. Ashley's group runs an amazing supportive housing home that doesn't have increased criminality. It doesn't have these massive robberies. It doesn't have these events. It's, again, I go back to, we're talking about human beings, and we're also talking about what we don't know and what we don't understand and what we're potentially fearful of. And then we have the images of sheltering and shelters. And I'm going to say this, and this is probably going to create some grief for me later, but one of the issues around shelters is we don't have standards around our shelters. And I think that's one of the things that we need to really focus on eventually moving towards. But we do have significantly strong standards when it comes to supportive housing. And the collaborators and partners that we have in there, we are, as a police service, extremely confident in the Bissell Centre, in Homeward Trust, and in our partnerships that we have developed with these folks to do things in the right way to ensure the safety of the neighborhoods, as well as the safety of the individuals in PSH.
Okay. Ashley, do you want to talk about you want to add anything to what Dan has said about what you've noticed in terms of issues you've had with the residents within the community? How common that is, how you deal with someone who's upset in your own building?
We don't, there isn't, when someone has moved in, if they have outstanding warrants or things that we need to deal with, we help them deal with it, and then they move on from that. They don't continue to increase those tickets, those warrants, which are usually, tiny warrants that are, I don't have the criminal jargon, but the LRT tickets and little things like that we help clear up, and then we move on. And they don't continue to increase those. They have a stable place and they no longer need to participate in survival activities and meeting their basic needs through activities. We don't have neighborhood complaints. We don't have we don't experience that in regards to the neighborhood. If somebody is angry in the building, we have de-escalation training. We have the ability to self-regulate and de-escalate and have conversations. And because we are a family, like when I say that we are a community and our staff virtually live with our residents, we are there 24/7. So we intimately get to know them and every aspect of their lives. Just like you would if you were living with your teenagers in your home, when you get to know their routines. We know them very well. And so when there is when you have such a strong relationship built, you use that to help calm someone down, because everyone gets angry and everyone has moments. And so that's not out of the human experience. And so it's how we work together to have those conversations and maybe take a breather. We need to go to the basement and have a breather and whatever. We just use the skills that we have to have conversations and the relationships that are built right from the beginning, because the roots of that are very important.
Emily, thank you very much, Ashley. Emily, can you, Dan mentioned having good standards. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So our standards start with the procurement process, whereby we publicly post requests for proposals for skilled operators that have demonstrated capacity to work in this field to submit that they would like to operate one of these facilities. And there are a number of qualifying requirements for those operators. And that's where you get organizations like the Bissell Centre, where Ashley works, who has a long-standing reputation in our community of serving people that are experiencing homelessness, applying. From there, it cascades to a contracting process. There's contracts that have requirements as it relates to the standards that are required, how the building looks, how things are reported on, those sorts of things. We augment that with a number of categories or dimensions of standards. There's actually 8 of them. Those standards really are about how a program provides support services. What does it look like to do participant-centered work with folks, really learning who they are and building supports around them from outside the building and inside the building. It looks at our intake processes, making sure that they're rigorous. It looks at how we're reporting on what we're doing. It also has dimensions related to property management and the role of the operator on site to ensure the quality look of a building, but also the property manager that has an external role to that building. These sorts of standards also really underscore the importance of diversity in the work that we do, and acknowledging that people come from different places and backgrounds and experiences, and how do we work with people to respect that diversity and appreciate that diversity, which for some folks, given some of the experiences they've had, is sometimes the first time that they've experienced that kind of thing. And so it's a really powerful way to forge relationships, which really contribute to the long-term success. Those standards are accompanied by a quality assurance process that looks at quarterly reviews with all operators. There is, of course, the issue resolution process that I've spoken about before. If an operator cannot solve an issue with a neighborhood, we get involved and help with that. And then there's, of course, the dimension around being a good neighbor, and the requirements for all operators to be good neighbors and contribute to their community. And how they do that is, of course, based on their community. So sometimes those are really place-based plans.
So yeah, we have one of the questions we've had that's come in while we're talking is how the performance of the operator in maintaining a safe and supportive housing site, how their success is evaluated. So what you're saying is you have a Homeward Trust as the developer and the organization, the nonprofit organization that hires the people that actually run the supportive housing sites. You've got fairly stringent requirements and performance measures, and that they understand going in, and you make them adhere to over the course of their operation.
Yes, that's correct. We also require regular reporting on what they're doing. And so we catch things early on. We also host a community of practice with our permanent supportive housing operators, where we can come together and discuss challenges and share learnings. So I think it's really, to be honest, I think it's really a combination between informal and formal measures, with the cornerstone of it being that we're partners on this work. Ashley and I are partners. Things are going to come up. We got to work through them together. At the same time, as my role as Chief Programs Officer is ultimately responsible. So I will be accountable and responsible, but so is Ashley. She's just responsible to a different organization. So we'll work together on that.
Can you and Ashley maybe talk a little bit about, and I'll start maybe with Ashley. What are some of the practical checks and balances that you have in place to make sure that that you're providing the support that you signed on to provide, and that Homeward Trust is helping the organization? Like, can you talk about a little bit about the interplay between the service provider and Homeward Trust as the developer, about how you make sure that you maintain those standards over the long term? Like, what does the practical relationship there look like? You kind of just touched on it, but can you dive a little deeper into that?
Yeah, so like Emily was saying, we're partners. So there's constant communication. Not only do we meet monthly, we report monthly. We have a database that we are documenting our activities into, that Homeward Trust has access to. We have a contract that we've signed and agreed to, and that is part of my role to ensure that we're meeting our obligations on a regular basis and evaluating and reviewing our program. There is a manager and a team lead that is also a part of doing that and ensuring that we're meeting our obligations and reporting back to Homeward Trust, our partner. we are, you know, sometimes Emily will give me a call and ask a question, and we work through that. There is just open and honest communication at all times. We also have, we also involve our staff in what our contract, like all of our team that works in the building, about our contract and about our agreements with Homeward Trust, that we are going to provide this level of standard to the community, the neighborhood, and our residents. And we're ensuring that that is something that is a constant conversation among us. And in some cases, we are also including the residents in this. For example, being a good neighbor, the residents are also involved in creating that relationship.
So, Chris, actually, those are great examples. I'm just going to add some more because it sounds like you really want specifics, which makes sense. Number one is training. Homeward Trust provides training. In addition to that, speaking for Ashley and her organization, their organization has a whole suite of training that all their staff have to go to as well. Those are required and contractually required. There are requirements related to the kinds of roles that are on site, the roles that they play, having job descriptions, keeping up on any necessary certifications. There's audits related to having appropriate insurance, having emergency preparedness in order, business continuity, those kinds of things. From a data perspective, they certainly report on things, but what do we do with that information? Some of the things that we look at and what they report on is their vacancy rate. So how many units are vacant? Now, Ashley's PSH always has a little bit more vacancies because they have roommates. So they have a constant challenge, but they got some innovative programming to deal with that. So I always expect their vacancy rates to be a bit higher than others that are single use apartments because they're just dealing with a challenge. Second thing we look at is how long people stay in a PSH site. Are they, and if they leave, where do they go? Would they be considered a successful exit? That would be a really important factor. A third dimension we'd look at is there any damages to the unit? We have an exceptional claims process whereby if there's damage to the unit, Homeward Trust covers that damage. Those kinds of things are other examples of things that we look at. We also look at a lot of the folks that end up in our PSH have maybe tried market housing once, twice, 3 times, and maybe it didn't work out. So we're looking at, we're in permanent supportive housing. Is this working out? Is this like for the long term? We've had people, like I say, who didn't work at this permanent supportive housing, but they went to another one and it was a better fit because of the services that are offered there. So we can see that in our data, which is critical. I hope that was helpful.
It was actually, and I want to just do a follow-up question on that somebody sent in a little earlier in the session, and that's that how long do people how long do residents typically stay in supportive housing, and do they live there forever, or do they transition to employment and self-sufficiency at some point? Why don't we go to Emily? We'll serpentine our way back to Ashley.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'll answer it holistically based on our standards, and then maybe Ashley can be more specific. So Homeward Trust and all of our operators operate from a recovery-oriented orientation, which quite simply means that we believe in people's ability to grow, recover, and evolve. So sometimes I've learned that, there's another belief that people are kind of stuck and they'll always be stuck. But we believe that if we invest and help people stabilize, that they may grow and maybe want to go live in market housing. And that does happen from time to time. From the perspective of permanent supportive housing, in terms of the definition, it's time unlimited. So there is no limit in terms of the supports. So as long as that person needs the supports, those supports are there.
Okay. Ashley, you've seen people come and go. What are those circumstances usually look like? What kind of time do you usually see that happening?
Mm-hmm. So we have been in operation since 2016. And through that time, we have seen people successfully exit, like Emily was saying, to market housing, stabilizing with employment, and all of the above. We have right now, our residents have been with us. Most of the residents have been with us for 2 years or more, and all in variation in their growth, in their life stages, and constantly looking for, because I either mentioned this time or last time about how each person has a case plan that we're working on with them. There's goals that we're working to achieve with them. We recently had one fellow enroll in school, and he's really excited to get that going, and he's able to do it distance, and so that's really great. We've even had a couple individuals move provinces to be closer to their family, and have been really successful in that, and we supported that, along with engaging with other services to help with that move.
Actually, is there usually sorry, excuse me. Yeah, just touching on you said something about people moving to another province or to live with family. Are those family supports there to begin with when they start supportive housing, or is that something they build while they're there? Can you talk a little bit about the role of people's family?
Yeah, family is really crucial, and in some cases, it's something that they're building from becoming stabilized, that they are reconnecting with their family and having a consistent phone number that is able to have someone to call and an address where people can write letters to and have easy connection to their families. And the moving home, moving back in a few of the cases, going home was supportive for them. So to be able to go and have the stability to actually go and move to where their end goal always was to get back to where their family was. It was just about staff supporting that connection as well.
Yeah. How many people Emily, you might want to answer this, but I'm going to give it to Ashley first. How many people have jobs? That's
various in all of our PSH sites. That's I can't, to be honest, I wouldn't be able to tell you on a number right now of who has jobs, but there's people working in different facets. So we have people that work day work, people who work go to school, which I qualify as work. There are people who are have full-time jobs, and then there's some people that are still working on creating that stability for themselves and just focusing on getting their health and well-being.
Is it common though?
In my experience, it's common.
Okay. Okay. Thanks very much. Sorry, Emily, do you want to add anything? I keep moving on to questions before asking all of you if you want to say anything. Okay. So we've had one question that's come up a couple of times, especially recently, especially after the last session, and it's really about broad community benefit. There's this notion that we do talk, and we have talked a lot in this session and the last one about the benefit to residents, but what's the benefit to the community that these developments are going into? We'll open that up to anybody who wants to take it.
I'll jump in. I don't want there to be a long pause or anything. So thanks for the question. I was reflecting on this question quite a bit because I think it's easy to talk about as someone who spends a lot of space in the advocating for people that are experiencing homelessness and helping people understand their experience. It's it's a good reminder to talk about the other side of the coin and what's the experience like of the people that are living in the neighborhood. And so I appreciate that the question's been asked again, and I'm definitely going to say many of the same things that I've said before, but hopefully I'll have a chance to kind of talk through them a little bit more. I think one of the things that I have mentioned before that's critical, but I want to expand on it based on some of the questions that were submitted, is I've talked about how the benefit for the community is really linked to that idea of ending homelessness. And so a lot of times, and Dan, I forgot your name there for a minute. It's been a long day. A lot of times, Dan referred to like symptomatic criminality, which is where people that are experiencing homelessness engage in criminal activity based on their circumstance. But once their circumstance of not being homeless is resolved, they no longer engage in that criminality. And the reason I bring that up is I think that, before I worked in housing and homelessness, and I talked to my family who lived throughout northern Alberta, and my friends, some of them are in this space and some of them are so far outside of this space, and I asked them what's on their mind, and they're like, well, it's that negative interaction they have on the street with someone who is likely homeless. And it's that negative interaction that sometimes is fear-based, like it makes us afraid. I've had those interactions before, or something happens. And the reason I'm bringing that up is when we solve homelessness and reduce homelessness in our city, we're really reducing those kind of interactions in our city, because that symptomatic criminality is really going away because people's needs are met. And so that's my perspective on how it contributes to a safer community, is because people are experiencing homelessness in our community. That is something we cannot deny. And so we can not deal with it and it'll blow up, or we can actually work to address it. So when I talk about, and I know there was a very specific question about, is ending homelessness possible? And it absolutely is possible, and I'll tell you why. The way we will end homelessness in Edmonton is through supportive housing. It's not everyone doesn't need supportive housing. Lots of people can be housed in market housing. But for a lot of the things that you're witnessing that are really disturbing from a perspective of visible homelessness, it's people that really need supportive living, and market housing is not going to be an option for them. And so that's one of the key benefits, is really reducing homelessness in our city and some of the related challenges that go with homelessness. It contributes to happier, safer communities. In terms of what Brendan brought up at the start of the call, which talks about that ratio of how much affordable housing is in a community, I think that really, and I've been at council where they debated bringing in that ratio, and it was a really big deal to bring that in. And one of the things that I observed with that conversation was the discussion about what makes a great community. And one of the principles and values that really guided that discussion was that diverse communities really contribute to a richer fabric of our communities. And so I believe that affordable housing really contributes to that diversity and contributes to experiencing that from a different perspective. And I think that when we look at the City of Edmonton, one of our key challenges has been that lack of supportive housing and those other affordable housing options that have really contributed to our homelessness problem. So anytime we're trying to solve homelessness, we're really looking at the upstream impacts that we call them, or all those things that feed into homelessness. And COVID-19 is another example of something that contributes to homelessness. When we talk about ending homelessness, it's really about ending homelessness from the perspective of functional zero. I don't know if people have heard that expression before, but it doesn't mean that no one is homeless. But what it means is that someone's experience of homelessness is brief, non-reoccurring. And so that means that they come into homelessness, but that we have the necessary supports and community safety net, that they leave homelessness right away and they stay away from homelessness because they're supported. And so that's really what I'm talking about. I'm not going to amplify the comments more about crime and property values, because I think we've discussed that. There's obviously a concern that those things will be impacted, and I think that's better covered by other people on this panel, and we've talked a little bit about it. But there's also the dimension of the conversation about having a well-designed and attractive building come into your community. And you know, with this kind of question that has come up, I really think a lot about what kind of questions community members would be asking if there was a new apartment building being built into their neighborhood, or what kind of questions that you would ask if there was a new rec center being built in your neighborhood. And if you really juxtapose or compare building a new rec center and the benefits you see of like access to amenities versus an apartment building, it's really a different conversation. And so while this conversation often focuses on how these buildings will not cause harm or those kinds of things, I think there's also a lot to be said for being part of a community that is committed to ending homelessness and part of a community that values diversity.
Okay. Dan, Emily, what's the benefit to the community?
I think Emily did a great job of saying that, and the other side of this is diversity is so many things, including economic diversity and experiential diversity. And I actually literally was talking about this with my wife before we did this panel tonight. There's a vacant lot near my house, and I said it last time. If someone said that we could put a permanent supportive housing up in that lot, I would be the champion for it. Because number one, we decrease symptomatic criminality, which is an issue. Number two, I truly believe in people, and I truly believe and I've been a police officer for 23 years. I worked in the both the federal and provincial correction systems for 3 years before that. So I've been in this system for 26 years. Prior to that, I worked in child welfare. I was a youth worker. I worked in McMahon Youth Services. I spent time in group homes. And I will tell you that some of my richest experiences in my life are with people who have experienced the things that lead them into homelessness and lead them into criminality and lead them into all kinds of different things. And I wish that I could just have some of these people come and talk on this panel. I'm thinking in my head right now of one of my closer friends that experienced all of these things and now goes out and in the community and does her best to actually help people access resources, because individuals who have these experiences and oftentimes come from trauma, we as a society have done in my opinion, a really poor job of addressing trauma and addressing how people end up in homelessness. And then we have an opportunity to judge them, and we unfortunately oftentimes we do. And having permanent supportive housing in your community, yep, it takes those people out of that symptomatic criminality, but it also, when we realize what's happening, and I'll go back to Brendan's point about affordable housing and non-market housing in communities, people don't even realize that they're there, because people will succeed because we're providing them with the necessities of life. Like I said, I spent 5 years walking 118th Avenue from 97th Street to 76th Street. And I experienced people that were experiencing homelessness, people that were experiencing all kinds of things. And I've watched as some of those people have flourished. The people that have flourished are people that have been given opportunities that places like Homeward Trust, Bissell, Boyle give these individuals, and do it without judgment and give them permission to be something more than the label they're given. And I think if I moved into a neighborhood, no one's going to ask that neighborhood, what benefit does that guy moving next door to me give? No one's going to ask that question. If they built an apartment complex in that lot that I just talked about in my neighborhood, no one's going to say, what benefit does that apartment complex give to me? But we're asking, what benefit does permanent supportive housing give? And actually, I think the benefit's probably greater, because from a societal impact and for how we do things and for how we see things and how maybe we as society need to change a little bit and think about people and less about other things, I think that it's an opportunity for us to be like, yep, this is an opportunity for us to help individuals and support individuals who are going to be strong neighbors, because I can tell you that's what Ashley's team has done. They make strong neighbors. And I think it's a benefit, it's a positive. And I think it's something we need to support as a community, because I think this is a strong community that supports people. And I think we need to just get there.
Ashley, I know it's a tough question to be the last person to add anything to, but anything you want to add as somebody who's providing services directly to people in supportive housing?
I don't think I have anything to add that hasn't been said.
Okay. I'm gonna move to some fairly rapid fire questions. Some of them are questions that have come in, and I'm just gonna straight up assign them to people. I'm actually gonna answer the first 5. The first 5 questions in this rapid fire are: is Homeward Trust a for-profit or non-profit? Homeward Trust is a non-profit. What percentage of tax is this facility going to pay? This facility will pay no tax, no property tax. Another question is, why weren't Strathcona and other neighborhoods within blocks of the development consulted? The consultation was focused on the specific neighborhoods that these were being put into, but it was open to surrounding neighborhoods. And judging by the postal codes of the thousands of people that have provided input so far, those surrounding neighborhoods have availed themselves of that opportunity. And question we got earlier today was, what communities are those that are advocating this supportive housing in these areas from? So I'm going to answer that question on 2 levels. One, generally speaking, there's in the course of this engagement, there's been on a citywide level relatively strong support for supportive housing as a concept. In the neighborhood specifically where supportive housing is proposed, it's generally mixed, but there is support in each neighborhood enough. In some neighborhoods, it's fairly significant. In other neighborhoods, it's not quite as significant, but it is definitely there. And then, are there families that are going to be residing in these homes, or is it individuals only? I think I can answer this, but I'm going to let Emily correct me if I'm wrong. The 4 sites that are being proposed here are individual only. So I'm going to turn it over to Brendan, because he's going to ask. Actually, sorry, no, I'm going to ask 2 questions of Emily and Ashley first. And then Brendan, you'll get some more technical questions. One is that how's the project funded, and how do we know that project funding will be there for the long haul? Emily?
Yeah, I think that's an Emily question. So we receive funding through 3 levels of government. So the municipal government, our city partners here, also the provincial government, a very large amount of funding, and also the federal government through Federal Reaching Home. And so based on the priorities that have been identified in this community, namely in the 10-year plan to end homelessness, it identifies that we really need to invest in this supportive housing, or we won't be able to reach our goal to end homelessness. And so I mentioned that gap before. Is ending homelessness possible? Yes, with supportive housing. And so we have prioritized that in our budget and would reallocate other things to support that priority as well.
Okay. Residents are charged, they have leases, so they're charged rent. Is that correct? When they're in supportive housing, are they learning life skills like grocery shopping, paying bills, paying rent to build on that self-sufficiency? Ashley, do you want to talk about that at all? Yeah,
the individuals that move into permanent supportive housing have a different range of skills and abilities, and we work with the resident where they are at, and that includes so that we help if they are in need of it, we'll help them with grocery shopping. Usually when someone moves right in, our occupational therapist takes our residents grocery shopping, and assists them and sees where their skill level is, and then assesses from there to see what other supports we could provide. There's assistance in rent. There's assistance in like cable and phone bills and things like that. And then we also support them in any other, like cooking, if they want to learn how to cook different types of meals. If they are wanting help with creating a chore list so that they know how to prioritize and schedule cleaning in, we'll support with that. Anything they really want.
And the rent is subsidized, correct?
Our rent is not subsidized. It is, well, Emily might be able to explain this a little bit better, but it's based on the Canadian mortgage CM, the rates anyways. It's it's lower than the average. It's affordable, but it's not subsidized.
Okay, Emily?
Yeah, so it's usually about 30% below market rent.
Okay. And if you don't, we talked earlier about some people having jobs or some people going to school. If you're not going to school, you don't have a job, how typically are people paying the lease? I'm going to choose Emily. Oh, no, Ashley's going to go. Ashley's unmuted first.
Yeah, sorry, we couldn't find my mouse. So the for various sources, like you said, if they don't have school or employment, some of our folks in our housing qualify for something called AISH, the Assured Income for the Severely Handicapped, which assists in paying rent. And yeah.
Okay. Brendan, I'm going to throw a question in your direction. There was some mention at some point of removing the scrubber, the EPCOR scrubber on the north or the west side of the King Edward Park site. Is that what is happening with that?
No, I did what you said not to do and used technical jargon. So I was talking about a public utility lot that is home to an EPCOR scrubber. It's a odor control facility. All that's happening is that area is being subdivided out, the housing parcel and the public utility lot, and that both of those will be removed from the River Valley area redevelopment plan. So that odor control facility from White Ave looks like a mound, an earth mound with some boulders around it. It's some underground infrastructure, but it will be staying in place. It's
Okay.
just, yeah.
Is it not kind of, I guess, forgive a technical term, but is it not kind of stinky?
Its job is to scrub that odor.
Okay, so that odor wouldn't waft into the building.
That's the plan. Yeah.
All right. Got another question about the. Actually, we've received this question a few times throughout the course of the engagements, and then a couple times today about buildings that fit into the neighborhood. Some of the neighbors looked at the buildings for development, and they feel like they don't necessarily fit within their communities. And some people are asking, will that change? Brendan can answer this after I answer it. But the engagement, the current survey we have, there's a component in there where you can talk about what your expectations around design are and what you want the developer to consider. That's a very good place to make those comments. I'll make sure that comment gets captured in the developing the report. But that I would highly recommend providing that feedback in the survey. Brendan, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, maybe just touching on a point that I raised earlier is that Homeward Trust provided those initial concept drawings to give people an idea of the massing, the footprint, the orientation of the building. To get a rezoning approved, you don't need a final building design. So that is a concept in flux. And yeah, they've taken on building input. And like Chris said, I think any notes about any of those things, Homeward Trust has indicated they want that input, what that final building design looks like, and whether you're able to please everybody remains to be seen. But specific constructive feedback, I think, is welcomed.
Okay, thank you very much. Brendan, with some of these sites in the construction, and I appreciate that you're a planner, not necessarily a construction and infrastructure expert, but with some of these proposed sites where some of the roads are in need of repair, will there be any kind of upgrades to the roads, or based on the needs of the development?
Well, we know in King Edward Park, if you look at the laneway access off 93rd Street, that's going to be the primary access, that laneway to the proposed development. That one just went through the city's laneway renewal program, alley renewal program, and that matches up with kind of the development expectation in terms of the laneways width, having a turnaround at the end, like the technical requirements that would have been asked of the developer to upgrade had that not already been taken care of. And similarly, the proposed Inglewood project, the access will be off of 112th Avenue's laneway, which is also slated for alley renewal. It kind of dovetails nicely. So those two you can see where upgrades would have been required, and you're going to get a new laneway surface. Similarly, I think we'll probably see new sidewalks go in around the King Edward project, and a new stretch of road is obviously required to connect the MacArthur Industrial Wellington project, because it's set back about 50 meters off of the roadway as it is. So yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of infrastructure upgrades and improvements that go into these projects. A lot of them are invisible because they're underground infrastructure. But in terms of sidewalks and roads, yeah, you'll see some improvements there.
Okay. Thank you. Emily, this is a follow-up question to a comment that you made about the buildings, newer buildings having a durable material to be built with, the newer buildings being built with an eye to having particularly durable material. Why is particularly durable material necessary for buildings of these variety?
It's not. I think that durable materials are necessary in buildings that are many different kinds of buildings, but buildings that have high use, where people are moving in and out, apartment buildings, corridors, so you don't have to always replace them, hospitals, those kinds of things. They consider the materials based on the use of the building. Yeah. Also, there's consideration related to preventing damages to units. So, something that can happen in a building very easily is water damage. Like, let's say you have the tub running and overfills, and that can cause cascading impacts all the way down the floors and be very expensive. But if you have a drain in the floor, it can catch a lot of it. Those kinds of things.
Okay. So it's practical like it is for any building.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going through as many of the questions as we can that have come in during the session itself, which has been a reasonable amount, and we've gotten through a reasonable amount of them as is. But can you talk, Ashley? Can you talk a little bit about house rules like pets, drugs, parties, that kind of thing?
So these are different per building. It's operator dependent. We do allow pets in our building. It is really only cats that we allow. Maybe smaller like hamsters and things, but no dogs, cats. And they pay a $50 deposit and have to sign a pet agreement to the care and well-being of the pet. We have our unit, everybody signs a lease, so they have the right to their privacy of their unit and can do what they would like to in their unit. If they would like to have a party, so some people over, they are allowed to. However, we have guidelines around noise. You have to be a good neighbor. And so if the noise is getting out of control, we will monitor, we will go up and we will ask them to turn it down. We will ask people to leave. If it's becoming too many people, we'll stop allowing people, have a conversation with the resident to say, there's a lot of people for your unit, and start monitoring it that way. I think that's.
But that's part of your support continuum, is
right.
Like part of the service that you provide and are trained on. And
you bet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. This next question is sort of touches on one we've talked about earlier, about the idea that again, like there's maybe some attraction to if people are living in supportive housing very safely and continuing to live safe, but attracting other people to the building, and then items like needles or condoms or whatnot. This is these are some of the examples the questioner has asked. End up in front of the building or in the neighborhood. What's the recourse of the building, and what's the recourse of the city? So Brendan, you might have to speak for the city on this one, but how does the city and how does the service provider and how does Homeward Trust deal with that?
In regards to debris in the community, for the most part, if those activities are occurring because the resident is housed, those activities are occurring within their home. We do, however, go out and clean up around our community and around our building. And if we do see debris within the needles surrounding the building, we pick them up safely and dispose of them safely within needle disposal blocks that we have on site. We also have, oh, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. It's been a long day. Yeah, so we do take care of the community also, and it's not just around needles, it's also garbage that is in the community, and not necessarily because it's from our building. It's just when the snow melts and you start to see all the trash and litter that is uncovered, we go out and clean that up.
And you had a question earlier about in a question, or one of your answers earlier, you mentioned the house where they provided alcohol support. What kind of specific issues do you see with providing any kind of harm reduction or anything along the harm reduction spectrum within supportive housing?
Like,
I think Dan just left, but Ashley, do
I
you
think
want
he
to?
tried to. I think he tried to unmute and accidentally hung up.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah, there he is.
Sorry, Dan. Dan, do you want to take a run at this question, and then Ashley, you've got something to say? You're still on. Oh no, go ahead.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep, good. You're good.
Harm reduction is an interesting concept, and we have 5 more minutes, so we could actually do another 2 hours on harm reduction. When I look at managed alcohol programs in things like Urban Manor and Ambrose Place, those are programs I'm very familiar with, and the successfulness of them is significant. And one of the things I think people don't understand about harm reduction is actually harm reduction oftentimes actually reduces the usage. It provides people. I had a really interesting conversation with an individual living at Urban Manor who said, when I was living homelessness, I would buy a bottle of whatever and I would chug it because I'd be afraid that someone would steal it from me. Now I'm living in this place and I know I have substance use disorder and I rely on alcohol, but I can drink it measured, and that individual actually went to work every day. So harm reduction, and especially things around managed alcohol and managed opioids, this is a topic that is one that is a significant amount of debates. You look at the CACP talking about decriminalization of small amounts of drugs. I agree with that as long as we have a whole bunch of other things in place, and that people talk about the Portugal model. And what we need is a continuum of care. What we need to really focus on, and we're not talking about this in as far as I know, these supportive housing are not managed alcohol programs or managed opioid programs. But if we really want to start talking about these things, and we really probably should, we need to start looking at the impact that it has when we provide people with safe supply, when we provide people with managed alcohol, and we actually reduce their usage and we increase their functionality and we decrease their need for any type of criminality. Those things become seriously important. And harm reduction, whether it's supervised consumption or managed alcohol, is part of a continuum of care for a population of people who oftentimes, and I go back to this all the time, the vast majority of individuals who are experiencing this have experienced trauma in their life. And when we fail to, and when we try to just deal with the substance use disorder or without looking at the trauma, we become that antacid tablet for pancreatic cancer when we're not actually dealing with the root cause. And that's the important part of this. And when you start looking at things like permanent supportive housing, you're starting to actually not only address the person's needs, but because of the amazing work done by places like the Bissell Centre, you're starting to address their trauma. You're starting to provide them with opportunities to deal with this stuff. Same thing with Urban Manor, same thing with Ambrose Place, same thing with multiple places. We are going along that continuum of care where we are actually working towards the betterment of society and the betterment of the human experience. Hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Dan. Ashley, do you want to add anything?
I was just going to say quickly that harm reduction is about reducing the harms associated with risky behavior. And so even housing someone who is experiencing homelessness is a harm reduction approach to reducing the harms associated with a risky behavior.
Okay. That's a good clarification. Thank you. Emily?
I just want to say thank you for that.
So from a Homeward Trust perspective, if there was needles around a building and debris or condoms, that operator wouldn't be meeting our standards. And so we would start with a conversation about if they were experiencing some challenges, such as a staffing shortage that they were addressing, or I'm just being really practical here. We would review the standards with them to make sure that they understood what the standards were and what their responsibilities were. And I highlight that because there is the role of property management, which is different than the operational side. And so sometimes it gets lost in between whose role is what. So we would look at that. And then finally, if we had an operator that wasn't compliant, I would issue a letter telling them they need to be compliant and the consequences of that. And if they still weren't compliant and was a major breach of contract, we would terminate the contract.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. So we're right at 9 o'clock right now. And so I just want to close by asking our panelists, what are 3 things you want people to remember from these sessions and some of the other sessions that we've done? What are 3 things you want people to remember about that maybe you've covered? I know, I understand, Dan, you're new, and Dan and Ashley, you're sort of new to this, but let's start with 3 things that you want people to remember as a close.
I'll start. The first thing for me is that we need to start not talking about homelessness and housing and supportive housing and substance use. We need to really start talking about people, because that's what this is about. When we look at the needs of individuals, and when Recover Edmonton did the ethnographic research into the homeless community, one of the 2 top things that the individuals were asking for was connection to community and connections to culture. So again, we're talking about people that want to be connected to community. And 3, in order for us to be the city we want to be, we need to start doing things differently, and we need to start embracing these types of partnerships in order to ensure that we don't over criminalize a population that shouldn't be criminalized in the first place.
Okay. Ashley or Emily?
I can go. I think my first is that permanent supportive housing is not a homeless shelter. That permanent supportive housing is an apartment building with supports that are housing people, and that Edmonton is about social change and supporting each other, and I think that is evident in how our strategies to end homelessness.
Great. Emily?
So hard to go last.
Well, we can't. I mean, Brendan's a bit of a ringer. If he wants to, Brendan, do you want to add anything before Emily goes?
I'm sorry, Brendan. I didn't mean to ignore you. It just keeps going back and forth between Deanne and I. I feel really bad now.
It's okay.
I can only think of 2 things. Ashley and Dan, you both added really good ones. So hopefully, Emily, I don't steal any of yours. But I think we have given these projects a lot of attention, but I don't want to leave members of the public with the idea that this is a novel concept that we're piloting with these 4 projects, that this is something proven to work here and elsewhere. And I mean, secondly, that doing this and the attention that these 4 projects have gotten, and the cost that we know that goes along with them, it doesn't mean an end to homelessness, but it's an important step that we need to take to get there. So it's why we all support it.
Okay. Emily?
Thanks, everyone. Sorry about that, Brendan. It's been a long day. So obviously this is about people, and so we've said that over and over again. I think something I haven't said about that, which I didn't say because it's hard to talk about, I haven't put all the words together yet, is just that often people that have experienced homelessness have not been treated like they're people. They're not treated with any human dignity, and they're not shown any measure of respect. And so if you can imagine moving through years, decades, all sorts of time where people won't even make eye contact with you on the street. When you enter a public facility, you're asked to leave. When you don't even have access to basic human things that make you a human being, such as a place to go to the bathroom or a place to be intimate with someone you love, or a place to prepare a meal, all those things that we maybe take for granted. And so I think what this work does is it really helps people, and it helps acknowledge that they're human beings and that they deserve respect and to be treated with dignity. And, perhaps, we have one mental image of someone who lives in a permanent supportive housing site. And all I ask you to do is divide that image by 10, divide that image by 20, divide that image by 100, because they are as diverse as the people that live in permanent supportive housing sites. So that's the one thing that I'd offer. I think the other thing, I'm just going to add two things. The other thing would be just that this is only made possible by the work of really, really, really dedicated people. There's a network of dedicated people in the city that are all connected and support each other in this work. And they really leverage leading and evidence-based practices. Edmonton is a leader in this work, and moving forward, I believe that this is possible because of that community that supports this.
Okay. Thank you very much, Emily. So we're at 9:06. I want to thank all of our panelists for giving us their time today. I want to thank everybody who watched today. I want to thank everybody who's provided input at any point in this engagement. The survey that we have for this engagement is still ongoing. I'd strenuously suggest that you take it and share it with as many people as you can. But that's it for us tonight. I want to thank again Brendan, Dan, Emily, and Ashley for giving us at least 4 hours of your time. In many cases, much more than that, to talk to as many people as we possibly can about these sites and why they're important and how they're going to work. And so, thank you for being open, and thank you for everyone who submitted questions and engaged with the process. Thanks very much.